Hello and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this video I'm going to talk about the article called Intellectual Motivation and the Good of Truth, written by Linda Zagzebski. The main question of this article could be formulated as follows. What is it to do the right thing intellectually? Or in a slightly different idiom, what is it to lead a life of epistemic virtue? And those questions sound very reminiscent of questions that we tend to ask in ethics. Right? In ethics, we always ask, what is the right thing to do? What is virtue? How should we live? What Zagzebski is going to do in this article is she's going to ask, well, that type of question, but now we are in the realm of epistemology. We are wondering about belief, about knowledge, about truth. And we want to know what it is intellectually to do the right thing. And Zagzebski's approach is to take the parallel with ethics very seriously. She is going to use several theories and models from ethics in order to think through what's going on in epistemology. And the results are pretty enlightening, I would say. Now, it may seem that it's very clear what makes something intellectually the right thing to do. How should I think? Well, I should think in such a way that I arrive at the truth, right? The good of epistemology is the truth, and we are doing the right thing insofar as we are getting to the truth, moving towards the truth. And that's right? That is sort of uncontroversial, one could say. But what is less clear is exactly what role the truth plays in intellectual virtue, in doing the right thing epistemically. And so Zagzebski is going to talk about 4 different models of understanding this relation of truth on the one hand to, epistemically virtuous acting or thinking on the other hand. She's going to talk about 4 models. And one of them is going to be her preferred model, while the others are going to come in for some criticism. So, what are those models? Well, here is model number 1. It's the most simple model, maybe. It's a consequentialist model. Now, consequentialism in ethics is a theory that says that you are doing the morally good thing insofar as your acts lead to the result that is like the good result, the result that ethical acts lead up to. And so, for instance, one version of consequentialism would say that what we really want is happiness, maybe happiness for as many people as possible. And so an act is good when it increases happiness, or maybe when it maximizes happiness, or something like that. So for a consequentialist, what is relevant is that the end result of the act is the thing that we desire, in this case maybe happiness, and the act is good insofar as it has this end result. If we apply a consequentialist mode of thinking to epistemology, the idea would be this. You are doing the right thing epistemically precisely if what you're doing ends up with the truth, or ends up in you believing the truth. Right? And if it ends up in you not believing the truth, then what you did wasn't good. It was not epistemically virtuous. You were not doing the right thing. There are some well-known problems with consequentialist theories in ethics that seem to sort of immediately carry over to consequentialist theories in epistemology. Zagzebski talks about 2 of them. I'm going to mention one of those, and I'm going to sort of mention another example of my own that's not in Zagzebski's article. So here is something that Zagzebski talks about. She says, well, one problem with these consequentialist approaches is, and I quote her, that no substantive activity is automatically evaluated positively. So what she means by that is this. If you describe any type of behavior, it's always for the consequentialist there's a question to be asked about whether that is right or not, because we first have to check whether that type of behavior leads to the desired goal. So, to take an example from ethics, if I say, well, I think we ought to be kind to each other, then the consequentialist is going to say, well, maybe we first have to check whether kindness leads to happiness. And there's something weird about that. At least there's something weird about that if you think that kindness is good as such, right? And that we don't need to ask some kind of empirical question about the results of kindness before we know that it's good to be kind. Well, something similar seems to be going on in epistemology, right? If I say, well, I think that we should, in our thinking, follow the laws of logic. And the consequentialist would say, well, maybe, but first we have to check whether following the laws of logic actually results in the truth. Well, that seems weird. I mean, it at least seems weird if you think that following the laws of logic is clearly good, irrespective of what its practical consequences are going to turn out to be. Okay, so that's maybe one reason to be a little bit wary of embracing consequentialism. Here's another example that might make you think in the same way. Right, suppose that there's some guy, let's call him Pete, and Pete is just right a lot of the time. In fact, he is right more often than I could be in whatever way I start to investigate the world. So when it comes to the best consequences, what I really ought to do is just listen to Pete every time. If I listen to Pete every time, I'll be right more often than in any other way that I try to form my beliefs. Should I just listen to Pete all the time? Well, suppose that I have no good reason to believe that Pete is so great, right? I just fall under his spell. He is like a guru to me. And I listen to Pete all the time. Am I living the intellectually good life? I would say that the answer must be no. Right? I'm not even really being rational. Even though, the consequences are great, I have all these true beliefs. Well, that's the type of scenario that consequentialism has a hard time dealing with. And so Zagzebski moves on from consequentialism to other ways of trying to understand the relation between truth on the one hand and doing the right thing intellectually on the other hand. And the second and the third model that she talks about is, she says, well, maybe what you're doing intellectually the right thing if the end of your activity is the truth. And then she says, well, there are two ways to think about ends or goals. We can think of them in terms of natural ends, and we can think of them in terms of intentional ends. Now, intentional ends, sort of goals, the intentional goals that we have with our activities, like I do something because it is my goal to this or that, are, I think, a little bit more familiar to us. Because natural ends are, they play a very important role in Aristotle's thinking and in centuries of philosophy after that, millennia of philosophy after that even. But it's a way of thinking that sort of went out of fashion in modernity, and it's maybe coming back a little bit. I mean, people are starting to reappreciate actually a lot of features of Aristotle's thinking, but we have to do a little bit more work intellectually, I think, to get into this space of thinking about natural ends. So here is the kind of thing that an Aristotelian might say about the goods of human life and the roles that they play in making certain activities good. The shortest version of the story, and I'm now quoting Zagzebski, the shortest version of the story would be something like this. Having true beliefs is part of one's natural end, of living a life of eudaimonia. Good cognitive activity contributes to the natural end of human life in the same way as good moral activity. And so the idea would be that, believing truths is part of what it is to be a good human being, a successful human being. That's just part of what it is to be a human being. Like, what it is to be a human being is not just to have a certain kind of body or something like that. There's also a normative component. Certain things are just good for human beings, and one of the things that is just good for human beings is having true beliefs. Okay, so when am I doing the right thing? Am I doing the right thing when I, just end up having good beliefs? Well, that would be consequentialism again. But the Aristotelian would probably say something a little bit differently. A little bit different. The Aristotelian would say something like, well, take morality. right? In ethics, I mean, the aim is not to have a lot of good deeds on your list of good deeds. I mean, it's not to have done certain things and now you're in a state where you have done a lot of those things. It's to actively be a good person, right? I mean, you have to be a morally good person. You have to be a virtuous person in such a way that you sort of naturally act all the time and in all circumstances in virtuous ways. And in the same way, to live the good life is to act virtuously epistemically. And that is to act virtuously in such a way that you reliably end up with true beliefs. But the value is in the acting and in having trained, maybe even, the disposition to act, the predisposition to act in these virtuous ways. Right? That's what the good is. It's not just the consequences. It's sort of having these virtues and living a life of virtue. Okay. It is a very short section in Zagzebski. She says, well, a lot of work needs to be done in order to work this out, because our ways of thinking about inquiry and truth and knowledge have changed since Aristotle. It's not immediately obvious how to take this model and apply it, in our current intellectual situation, but it's an interesting project. And that's basically where she leaves it. She says this is an interesting project, something that we might want to pursue. So she doesn't really criticize it. She just tells us that there's no really worked out proposal here, but it could be interesting to pursue. Okay, here's the third model that we could use to try to understand what is when we are epistemically doing the right thing. It is, again, in terms of ends, but now in terms of intentional ends. So in terms of our aims. And so the basic idea would be that I'm intellectually doing the good thing, not when I arrive at the truth, but when I aim to arrive at the truth. And this, again, is a thought that is very familiar from ethics. It's the idea that in ethics, the point is not so much that I, for instance, end up increasing happiness. No, I'm doing the right thing when I aim to increase happiness. And so here the idea would be that I'm doing intellectually the right thing when I aim to arrive at the truth, even though, maybe due to unforeseen circumstances, maybe I'm unlucky this time, maybe I don't arrive at the truth, but I should aim to arrive at the truth. Now, here is something that Zagzebski considers in quite some detail. It's whether we can actually do this, right? Can we actually form beliefs with the aim of arriving at the truth? And could we also form beliefs without the aim of arriving at the truth? Because, there needs to be this distinction. If there's not this distinction between two ways of forming beliefs, one of them aiming at the truth, one of them not aiming at the truth, well, then there's no distinction here. There's no theory here. There's nothing there. Clearly we can do things in real life, sometimes aiming at increasing happiness and sometimes not aiming at increasing happiness. That's clear. But for beliefs, it's a little bit more subtle, because you might think that any belief is formed with an aim at truth, right? When I believe something, I believe that it's true, right? That's just the same thing as believing it. So could there be beliefs that are formed without an aim at the truth? Well, here is Zagzebski's worked out example. She talks about a bathroom scales. And so this is something that you can use to weigh your body, right? And she says, well, if I go to my friends and I say that I want a new bathroom scale, but I want to buy a bathroom scale that says that I have lost 5 pounds. Okay, so we are assuming here that this is not somebody who is extremely thin and wants to gain some weight. It's somebody who wants to lose some weight. Okay, well, this is very strange, right? If I say, oh, I want to buy a new bathroom scale that shows me that I have lost 5 pounds. What exactly is this project I'm engaged in? Well, it seems to be a project where I want to form a belief, right? I want to form the belief that I've lost some weight. But I can't just form that belief, right? It's hard for me to sort of sit and think and say, okay, now I believe that I have lost some weight. Belief is not voluntary like that. So I need some input that will help me. And a set of scales that are like, well, not a bathroom scale that shows me that I've lost 5 pounds, that could do that. So suppose that I, find some scales somewhere, and I don't care whether they're accurate, right? I don't care whether they're accurate. I only care that they show me that I've lost 5 pounds. I get on it, I've lost 5 pounds. I form the belief that I've lost 5 pounds. I'm happy. Well, Zagzebski says, here I seem to have formed the belief without aiming at the truth. I was aiming at the pleasurable sensation of believing that I lost 5 pounds. It's a little bit of a strange situation, maybe, but it can happen. And there could be a different kind of situation where I actually do want to know the truth. And maybe there are even, Zagzebski talks about the possibility that maybe there is one situation in which I only want to know the truth if I've actually lost 5 pounds, and I don't really want to know it if I haven't. But okay, I might still be aiming at the truth. And then there's the even better, sort of epistemically speaking, even better situation where I just want the truth, right? And I want it whatever it is. So there are sort of different gradations maybe in aiming at the truth, in how strongly we aim at the truth. Now, actually, although this bathroom scale example is a bit recherché, right? It's a bit strange. I actually think that something like this situation happens a lot. I think all of us probably, but some maybe more than others, engage in intellectual activities where we want to form a certain belief, and we aim at forming that belief rather than aiming at the truth. Here's an example. Suppose that I really don't like a certain politician. Let's call him Pete, because we were calling people Pete anyway. I dislike Pete. And somebody said, yeah, I think Pete is corrupt. Now I think, oh yeah, maybe that's true. I'm going to do some research. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go on the internet, I'm going to go to a search engine, and I search for Pete is corrupt. Right? And of course, I get all kinds of pages that contain the text Pete is corrupt. And I read them. And there are all these examples of corruption. And Pete is so corrupt. And I close my computer and I go to bed sort of enraged at Pete's corruption, but also happy at, being allowed to believe, and now believing that Pete is this not just nasty but also corrupt. If I really aimed at the truth, of course I should also have searched maybe for Pete is not corrupt, right? Which would have probably gotten me to very different pages, maybe pages disputing the claims of the first set of pages. I should have done some more research. I think we very often engage in activities where we sort of search for precisely the kind of information that will generate certain beliefs in us that we think are going to be comfortable or nice or, that fit our preconceptions. And that is not aiming at the truth. And that would not be intellectually virtuous. So the bathroom scale example is a bit strange maybe, but I think something like this actually happens a lot of the time. And so I think I agree with Zagzebski that there is a strong and important distinction between forming a belief while aiming at the truth and forming a belief without aiming at the truth. Both of these things happen, and one of them is clearly intellectually better than the other. So, Zagzebski says, I can aim for truth as such in my belief formation. So this again is a promising model. Okay, here's going to be the fourth model, which is Zagzebski's preferred model. And that is to think about this not in terms of aims and not in terms of consequences, but in terms of motives. Right? A motive is, the why. Zagzebski herself says that it's some kind of emotional state that motivates us. Right, that's why it's called a motive, of course, that motivates us, that puts us in motion, that makes us search out something. And Zagzebski's suggestion here in this section is that there might be two motives, at least, that are relevant epistemically. There is a love of truth. I might love to know true things, right? And that might motivate me to search out information, to form beliefs in ways that are as reliable as possible. I could also be motivated by an aversion to falsehood, right? I don't want to believe false things. One thing that Zagzebski does again, and this is a little bit reminiscent of what we just talked about with the bathroom scale, is she spends some time explaining that there is a difference between, trying to avoid falsehoods while being motivated by an aversion to falsehoods, and trying to avoid falsehoods while being motivated by something else, right? I might move in social circles where if I say things that are false, people will laugh at me and I will lose my reputation. And so I try to avoid falsehoods, not because I love the truth or because I hate falsehoods, but because I want to safeguard my reputation. So that's possible, and it wouldn't be very virtuous, at least not intellectually virtuous. But if I try to avoid falsehoods because I hate falsehoods, I have an aversion to them, in the same way that maybe I try to alleviate human suffering because I hate human suffering. I feel compassion towards human suffering. I feel compassion towards the humans who suffer. That's good. Like, acting from compassion is good. In a way that, like, if I alleviate human suffering because I can't stand all the screams, that's not very good. If I act out of compassion, that's good. If I act out of an aversion to falsehood, that's good. If I act out of a love of truth, that is good. So maybe we should understand the good of intellectual life in terms of this type of motivation, right? We're living the good life when we are motivated by the love of truth or the aversion to falsehood. There's an interesting side issue that Zagzebski spent some time discussing, which is how to weigh these two things against each other, right? Because, well, here's one. Suppose that I have an aversion to falsehoods. I really, really don't want to believe any false things. Well, what I should do is never form any beliefs. If I don't form any beliefs, I won't believe any falsehoods. But of course, then I don't know any truths either. So there is a sort of balance to be struck between avoiding falsehoods. If you want to avoid as many falsehoods as possible, you should have an incredibly high standard before you believe something. And believing truths, the love of truth. I mean, if you want to know as many truths as possible, you should have a reasonable but not a very high standard of believing things. And Zagzebski says, well, maybe we can again use Aristotle as an inspiration here. Right? There's something called practical wisdom or phronesis. And practical wisdom is required in daily life to balance different types of virtues. Right? I need to balance all kinds of things. I need to balance, for instance, my love of my family with my love of my neighbor, because I can only spend so much time with, anything, anywhere. I might need to balance different virtues. In every practical circumstance, I need this practical wisdom that allows me to strike the right balance. And something like that could be true epistemically as well, right? I need to strike the right balance between searching for truth and avoiding falsehood. So, finally, Zagzebski tells us a little bit about knowledge, and she suggests that maybe knowledge can be understood in terms of this type of intellectual virtue, right? The difference between merely believing something that is true and really knowing it might be that in really knowing it, I've been motivated by these intellectual virtues. And so she tells us at the end of section 6 that maybe knowledge is an act of intellectual virtue. That's what it is to have knowledge. Maybe we should say a successful act of intellectual virtue, something like that. So we have seen that there are maybe very strong parallels between the epistemic good and the ethical good. And we have seen several models of understanding the role of truth in the epistemically good life. Right? We could think of it in terms of natural ends. We could think of it in terms of our aims, and we could think of it in terms of our motivations. And the kinds of things that we learn from ethics and from contemplating the good life seem to be extremely relevant when we contemplate epistemology and leading the good intellectual life. And it's even the case, maybe, that just as it's difficult to live an ethically good life, or at least many of us believe that it's difficult to live an ethically good life, it's maybe also difficult to really live an epistemically good life. Right? Maybe we should be far more worried than we usually are about believing all kinds of things that are false or at least not well motivated. Things that we believe just because they are comfortable to us, because they fit with the things that we've been taught, and so on and so forth. And so we really need to cultivate those intellectual virtues in order to rise above the common lot, as Zagzebski says, and arrive at the truth. It's this motivation to do that, according to Zagzebski, this motivation to rise above our common situation and to really get at the truth, that makes us search for reliable ways of gaining knowledge. And so to get the good consequences, to get at the truth, which is what the consequentialists so much wanted us, maybe that is only possible for someone who is really animated by a virtuous desire to find the truth. All right. Thank you for listening, and see you in another video.